You may have seen this viral video that's been making the rounds from Arizona State University, in which a couple of students, who happen to be Caucasoid males, are sitting by themselves doing their schoolwork, minding their own business, not bothering anyone, when they're accosted by a couple of female students of color. Is that the proper descriptor? They change the rules so often, it's difficult for an old fart like me to keep track sometimes. Anyway, the female students of color, who were the ones filming the encounter, by the way, they march up to these two white kids and demand to know what they are doing there. And one of the kids, not unreasonably, says, I don't know, we're doing our schoolwork? Whereupon he and his associate are informed by these two representatives of the woke race police that they must leave the area immediately because this part of the campus, or this part of the building, I'm not sure which one it is not for them. White kid number one inquires, again, not unreasonably, as to what the hell these words mean that this crazed maniac is yelling at him, and he is duly informed that he is not allowed to be in the multicultural center because he is white. But it's worse than that, because not only are these kids guilty of being in a forbidden space with the wrong skin color, but the one kid, he's got a Police Lives Matter sticker on his laptop, and the other kid is wearing a shirt that says, did not vote for Biden. Uh-oh, trigger warning! And yeah, you guessed it, crazed student of color number one then duly informs the both of them that the sticker and the t-shirt mean they are obviously racist, and thus they are making other people uncomfortable, and they really, really need to make like a tree and get out of here. Now, I've heard a lot of people saying that these two kids handled themselves pretty well since, of course, they were totally unprepared to be accosted and filmed by a couple of wacky segregationists who obviously were trying to create a viral video for purposes of narcissistic self-glorification. And yeah, I guess that's true on a certain level, but I'm also going to take issue with that characterization, because those of us who are sane, reasonable people need to learn to stop giving serious rebuttal to things that do not warrant serious rebuttal. The two kids who were accosted, they started telling these girls how self-evidently nonsensical their arguments are. For example, you can't call a space multicultural if it's intended to be racially segregated and politically monolithic, because obviously that is the opposite of multiculturalism. But setting everything else aside, there was only one fitting response to this act of harassment, and it goes like this. Ma'am, there is nothing vulgar or obscene about my friend's shirt or the sticker on my laptop. If you find these things offensive or upsetting, that is your problem, not mine. But I'm afraid I'm very busy right now, and I'm going to get back to doing my schoolwork. You have a good day. That is all that needed to be said. If these crazy people insist on continuing to scream abuse at you, you pretend they aren't there. They warrant your attention just as little as their arguments warrant serious rebuttal. But it's fascinating to listen to the words being shrieked by the two female students of color who are doing the accosting and the harassing, because it reminds me a lot of the radical leftist politicians who are regularly polluting our public discourse. They know how to mouth all the right fashionable woke platitudes of the day, but they have no awareness of the fact that the worldview they are expressing is not just shockingly racist, but internally incoherent to a degree that is just comical and embarrassing. On the one hand, you're saying, you have to leave this space because multiculturalism doesn't include white people. And when the second white kid asks the obvious question, well, why is white culture not culture? They scoff out loud and proclaim that there is no such thing as white culture. Well, which one is it, ladies? Because I'm afraid you can't have it both ways. If white culture is something that doesn't exist, then you can't exclude it from the multicultural center. But 2 sentences ago, you were arguing that there is such a thing as white culture, but it doesn't fall under the auspices of multiculturalism. So congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. America. This is what your kids' teachers are filling their heads with in the public high schools. And if this is all news to you, if you weren't even keeping track or paying attention while your children were being turned into wild-eyed segregationist revolutionaries, then congratulations on being shitty parents. But if you're looking for an authentic old-time racist experience, if you want to feel what it's like to live in a bygone world of segregated lunch counters and separate but equal race laws, Just pay a visit to any American public university campus in the 21st century and you'll find a perfectly reasonable analog. And if you're watching that video as the parent of kids who are in high school right now, then heed these words. If you want your kid to be a healthy, well-adjusted young adult who's equipped to make useful contributions to society, then keep them as far away from a university campus as you possibly can. If you want them to prosper, encourage them to learn a trade and acquire some useful skills and a healthy work ethic. If they want to continue their formal education, they can do it at the local community college. If you live to be 300 years old, you know what words you will never hear someone say? Aside from, I want to bang Rosie O'Donnell. You'll never hear someone say the words, I sure do regret learning that skilled trade when I was young. But you will hear a hell of a lot of people, on the other hand, express regret that they went straight to the university and earned a worthless bachelor's degree in the humanities and acquired a crushing six-figure student debt load. I mean, look at Jim Eagle. He's got 2 master's degrees and a PhD, and he can barely hit the damn music when the host tells him to. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where you can earn your sword fighting and jousting certificate in just 12 weeks, but we will not be held liable for any lost eyes or limbs. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. I am your eponymous host and humble servant, and I've got a pop quiz for you right off the bat tonight. If you had to guess, on a percentage basis, how much the increase has been in total spending by the U.S. federal government in the first 2 decades of this century, between the years 2000 and 2021, what would your guess be? The increase in national population between then and now has been 15.1%, so you might reasonably surmise that the increase in spending has been roughly commensurate with that number. Or, if you're a more pessimistic sort, or a more realistic sort, as the case may be, you might guess maybe 50%, 75%, 100%, even 200%. Well, you still wouldn't be even halfway to the real answer. Between the year 2000 and the year 2021, total outlays by the federal government have increased by 405%. Let that number rattle around in your head for a little bit, because it's a lot to take in. Now, currently, the geriatric lunatics who run our government are haggling over a couple of spending bills that have price tags of $1.5 trillion and $3.5 trillion respectively. To put those numbers in perspective, $1.5 trillion is almost as much as the entire government spent for the entire year of 2000. And $3.5 trillion is the same amount that the entire government spent in 2009 in Barack Obama's first year as president. Last year in 2020, the amount we spent on the 3 so-called COVID stimulus bills was $2.1 trillion, which is more than the entire government spent in the entire year of 2003, which is interesting to note because that was a year that saw the creation of the Homeland Security Department, which at that time was the biggest expansion of the federal administrative state since the Second World War, and also the year that we invaded and occupied Iraq, when we also were already occupying Afghanistan. To reiterate, we spent more money on so-called COVID stimulus last year, which was a government-based solution to a problem that was created solely by bad government policy, than we spent on creating the DHS department while invading Iraq, while occupying Afghanistan. Are you sick to your stomach yet? Because I can keep going if you're not. But I think I've made my point. But I'm not here tonight just to depress you with tales of administrative incompetence and drunken sailor government spending. I am here to propose solutions, to put my money where my mouth is, because everybody loves to complain about what's wrong, but not enough people take the time to hammer out ideas on how to make it right. And I have a 6-point plan for how we really and truly could do that if we could just find a way to muster the collective political will to make it happen and to take our country back from the drunken sailor Democrats and Republicans who don't know how to do anything but grow the government and spend us off the cliff. Number 1, repeal the 16th Amendment and the 17th Amendment. These 2 amendments have each done immeasurable harm to our country, so it's no coincidence that they were both ratified during the spring of 1913, during the early part of Woodrow Wilson's first term in office. The imperial presidency was largely created by Wilson and perfected by Franklin Roosevelt. And ever since then, since around 80 years ago, we've just sort of assumed that's the way things are supposed to be, but they aren't. The president is not supposed to be an emperor. In terms of domestic policy, the president should be no more powerful than a state governor or the Speaker of the House. The 16th Amendment enshrined the federal income tax as a permanent fixture of our national political life, which it was never supposed to be. The original federal income tax was a temporary wartime measure during the Civil War, and they got rid of it during Reconstruction. It went back to not existing for the next 45 years, and the country mostly did just fine. Under the auspices of the original Constitution, taxes are collected at the local and state level, and the state governments finance the operations of the federal government. The states are the ones in charge. The states control the purse strings, which is as it should be. That is a good and proper thing. As our government was originally conceived, if the federal state wanted to expand itself, it had to make a case to the states for why it should be allowed to do that. The 16th Amendment thus removed one of the most important checks on federal government power. The 17th Amendment made senators directly elected by popular vote rather than being appointed by the respective state legislatures. This has also been an unmitigated disaster for the country. The founders of the Republic created a bicameral legislature for the sole purpose of having one house that was elected by the people, the House of Representatives, and the other house, the Senate, with members who were answerable directly to the state governments. The idea of the bicameral legislature was conceived so that the individual citizen and the state legislatures would both have direct representation in the United States Congress. The 17th Amendment thus defeats the entire purpose of having a bicameral legislature. The 6-year length of term for senators, that was supposed to be a check against the fact that senators were subject to being recalled at any time by a 2/3 or 3/4 vote of the state legislature to which the individual senator was accountable. So if you had an asshole like Willard Romney who got his Senate seat by pretending to be a conservative, but then started voting with the liberals as soon as he got into office, then the Utah legislature, they were able to recall his ass with immediate effect. But the senators who are popularly elected, the way it is now for 6-year terms, it creates a political aristocracy whose members are untouchable and unaccountable and can spend 6 whole years thumbing their noses at the people of their state. Number 2, term limits for everybody in the federal government. We already have term limits for the president and the vice president, but the rest of that job remains undone. If it were up to me, I would make the presidency the same as the Mexican presidency, the same as the Confederate presidency. That is to say, a single 6-year term, no re-election. Same with the Senate. 1 6-year term, no re-election. In the House of Representatives, you can be re-elected twice for a maximum of 3 terms. Nobody needs to spend more than 6 years holding national elective office. Elected office should not be a career or a way of life. When they are, it just breeds corruption. But we shouldn't stop with elected office. Employment in the federal administrative state shouldn't be a career or a way of life for anybody. That is how we got a deep state full of professional bureaucrats who are not accountable to anyone for anything. There should be no such thing as a professional federal bureaucrat. They should be limited to 6 years just like everybody else under the Curmudgeon plan. Public service at the federal government level should be a temporary diversion, a thing where you only have a limited number of years in which to do the best job you possibly can do, because the clock is always ticking. When there is no ticking clock, when everybody's just biding their time until retirement, nobody does their best work. We need a system where people working in the federal administrative state are motivated to do their best work. Under our present system, we don't have that. We have a system that rewards corruption and rewards political opportunism, and we can put an end to it if we want to. Number 3, get rid of the departments of energy, education, and homeland security Just for starters, the executive branch is assigned 4 areas of responsibility in the Constitution: national defense, the security of our frontiers, the regulation of interstate commerce, and the settling of disputes between the states. We need to start slashing and burning until we get back to that. Each of these departments has existed for multiple decades now, and there is precious little evidence that the country or its people have gained any discernible benefit from it. With the education department in particular, every results-based metric would indicate that it has had a spectacularly disastrous effect on the academic achievement levels of our elementary and middle and high school students. There simply is no compelling reason why school curricula need to be formulated in Washington, D.C. rather than in your state capital or in your county seat or in your own city or town. The Homeland Security Department, it was invented out of whole cloth because George W. Bush needed to look like he was doing something strong and decisive in the wake of the 9/11 attacks. There was no reason why we needed to add an entire new layer of federal bureaucracy rather than improving the performance and the interagency coordination of the agencies that we already had. But hey, why do a better job when you can just grow the government instead? Number 4, no more normalized diplomatic and trade relations with our hostile communist adversaries. 40 years ago, Jimmy Carter betrayed the Taiwanese people by switching diplomatic recognition to Communist China and handing them the Chinese seat in the UN. 30 years ago, men like Joe Biden and George H.W. Bush assured us that if we granted most favored nation trade status to the Communist Chinese, they would become so drunk on that sweet, delicious nectar of capitalism that communism would end and they would magically transform into a Western-style liberal democracy. The second part never happened, of course, but we never hear anybody even contemplating ending this 3-decade-long experiment that has obviously and spectacularly failed, while China has dragged off all of our physical and intellectual property that they could get their grubby little hands on, while we watched and did little else but smile politely. Today, let's suppose China released a bacterial pathogen in our country and then cut off the supply of antibiotics. They would have just won World War III without ever firing a shot. We already know there are members of Congress who have banged Chinese spies and faced no consequences for it. Members of Congress who've had Chinese spies drive their cars for 10 years and faced no consequences for it. One day down the road, probably some decades from now, we'll probably find out how many current members of Congress and how many people in our fake news media were actually actively on the payroll of the Chinese Communist Party. And it's going to be a shockingly high number. We used to call such people enemy saboteurs because that's what they fucking are. Number 5, end all federal entitlement programs. And yes, that includes Social Security and Medicare. This goes hand in hand with repealing the 16th Amendment. If a citizen lives out their entire life without ever leaving their state, and they never serve in the armed forces, then voting in presidential elections is the only involvement they ever need to have with the federal government. That's the way things were for the majority of our history, and it should be that way again. There is no good reason why the federal government needs to take money out of the paycheck of every worker every week just as a matter of course. As our system was originally conceived, taxes and levies were between the individual citizen or company and the state or the locality in which he or she lives or does business. A direct transactional relationship between the individual citizen and the central government in Washington, D.C., that is not the normal order of things. That has only existed for the last 107 years out of our nearly 250-year history. The existence of federal income tax is the exception and not the rule. If we want to get back to living in a world of fiscal sanity, where our central government doesn't have the option of out-of-control drunken sailor spending binges where their total outlays increased by 405% in a mere 20 years, we would do well to start realizing such things. Number 6, get government out of the student loan business. Nobody in the United States has raked in more bushels of money hand over fist these past 30 years than the universities have. Ever since the federal government started underwriting all the student loans, which turned higher education in this country into little more than a predatory lending scheme, where the colleges and the universities have no profit motive for delivering a quality education because the government is going to be on the hook to pay off all of the defaulted loans anyway. And this has got to stop. Do we want our public universities to be racism factories, where our young adults learn that segregation is healthy and normative, where people pay $500,000 just to learn how to vomit out the fashionable woke platitudes of the day, while not learning any marketable skills or having any useful knowledge imparted to them? Do we want to keep turning out college graduates who are unequipped to do anything but spend their entire lives back in the intellectual bubble of the university campus, filling the heads of the next generation with the same poisonous race hatred that their own heads were once filled with, in furtherance of a nationwide predatory lending scheme that serves only to enrich the plutocratic oligarch class? Or do we want to choose a different path? With all of these things, the choice is ours. We just have to summon the moral courage to do what we know is right. Thanks for watching. See you Wednesday. Do not comply. Get off my lawn.